What if Atlantis didn't fall because of war? What if it fell because something was watching, waiting, and quietly weakening it from the shadows? Long before the great city sank beneath the waves, strange disruptions began. Power systems faltered, leaders argued, priests whispered of a presence they could not explain. Atlantis was radiant, canals glowing with crystal light, towers piercing the heavens, its people certain of eternity. Yet, beneath the brilliance, silence lingered, a silence that was not peace but anticipation. The city's engineers noticed anomalies, conduits humming at odd frequencies, crystals flickering without cause. Priests spoke of dreams filled with shadows, of voices echoing in forgotten tongues. Citizens dismissed these as superstition, but Thoth, the keeper of wisdom, saw a pattern. He warned the council. The storm does not announce itself with armies. It begins with silence. It begins with whispers. His words were met with laughter, yet unease spread. The silence before the storm was not emptiness, it was presence. Something vast, unseen, patient, watching, waiting, and Atlantis, in its brilliance, did not realize that eternity was already slipping away. If you love mythology and history from all cultures and forbidden ancient stories, subscribe, because this channel reveals the secrets behind every myth. And hey, let me know from where you're watching. I promise Thoth won't judge your internet connection. The silence that hung over Atlantis was unsettling, but soon it gave way to signs, subtle, almost invisible, yet impossible to ignore. Farmers were the first to notice. Their crops, lush and vibrant, one day wilted overnight without disease or drought. Sailors returned from voyages with stories of stars shifting in the sky, constellations bending as though rearranged by unseen hands. Merchants swore their scales betrayed them, weights fluctuating without reason, as if invisible fingers tampered with their trade. The council dismissed these accounts as superstition. Atlantis is eternal, they declared. Our systems are flawless, but Thoth, keeper of wisdom, saw design in the chaos. These are not accidents, he warned. They are signals. Something is watching at night. Citizens began to hear vibrations rising from the canals, low, resonant tones that pulsed like a heartbeat. Children woke screaming, claiming they saw figures at the edge of their vision, shadows that vanished when approached. Priests whispered of omens, but their rituals faltered, their chants interrupted. By forces they could not name, the signs multiplied. Crystals glowed without touch. Shadows stretched unnaturally across walls. Communication devices carried voices no one recognized, distorted, fragmented, speaking in languages no Atlantean understood. Fear spread quietly. Families avoided the canals. Merchants closed their stalls early, and soldiers hesitated to patrol at night. The brilliance of Atlantis, once a source of pride, now felt like a beacon drawing attention from something vast, unseen, and patient. Thoth's words echoed in the minds of those who listened. The storm does not strike with armies. It begins with whispers. The signs were clear. Atlantis was not alone. Something was watching. Something was waiting. The signs were undeniable. Crops withered without cause. Stars bent unnaturally. Shadows stretched across walls as if alive. Yet the Council of Atlantis clung to denial, insisting their empire was eternal. Into this chamber of arrogance stepped Thoth, the keeper of wisdom, the one who saw patterns where others saw coincidence. He stood tall, his voice steady, carrying the weight of truths too heavy for the rulers to bear. "You believe Atlantis eternal," he began, "but eternity is fragile. Something watches us, something tests us." The council scoffed. "Atlantis has no enemies," they declared. "Our brilliance is unmatched, our systems flawless." Their words rang hollow, but pride blinded them. Thoth pressed on. He spoke of the distortions in the stars, the whispers in the canals, the voices carried through communication crystals. He described civilizations erased from memory, their ruins buried beneath oceans, their names forgotten. "We are not the first," he warned. "Others have faced this presence, and they fell." The chamber grew tense. Some rulers shifted uneasily, others laughed to mask their fear. But outside the palace walls, the people listened. Merchants closed their stalls early. Families avoided the canals. Soldiers hesitated to patrol at night. The city's confidence wavered. Thoth's warning was not prophecy. It was recognition. He had seen the signs before, in records older than Atlantis itself. The Watcher did not strike openly. It weakened silently, patiently, until collapse was inevitable. The council dismissed him, but the seed of fear had been planted. Atlantis stood radiant, yet fragile, and Thoth knew the storm had already begun. The whispers and warnings had unsettled Atlantis, but the capital itself soon became the stage for events that no one could dismiss. It began with the marketplace. Merchants opened their stalls to find goods rearranged, scales refusing to balance, and coins scattered across the ground. Customers swore they heard voices echoing between the marble columns, though no speaker could be found. The air itself seemed charged, heavy with tension. In the grand avenues, statues cracked without reason. Their faces, once serene, now appeared distorted, as though reshaped by invisible pressure. Citizens gathered in awe and fear, whispering that the city was being watched. Children pointed to shadows that moved against the walls, shifting independently of the sun. The palace was not spared. Courtiers reported corridors that lengthened unnaturally, doors that led to places they had never seen before. Guards patrolling at night claimed the torches flickered with colors unknown, casting shapes that resembled figures standing just beyond reach. Even the animals sensed it. Horses refused to enter certain streets. Dogs barked at empty corners, and birds abandoned the plazas entirely. The capital, once vibrant and alive, now felt haunted. Thoth walked among the people, his eyes heavy with recognition. "These are not accidents," he said quietly. "The city itself is being tested. What you see is not destruction, but intrusion." His words carried weight, though few dared to repeat them aloud. The council attempted to silence the rumors, declaring the events mere coincidences. But the people knew better. They had seen the statues crack, heard the voices, felt the air shift. The capital was no longer a place of brilliance. It was a stage for something unseen, something vast, something patient. Atlantis stood radiant, yet fragile. And in the heart of its capital, the unusual events were no longer whispers. They were undeniable signs that the storm had entered the city itself. The unusual events in the capital had shaken Atlantis, but what followed was far more terrifying. It began with the crystals. For centuries, they had been the empire's lifeblood, powering canals and illuminating towers. But now, they behaved in ways no engineer could explain. Some pulsed brighter, others dimmed, and a few shattered. In the great plaza, fountains erupted skyward, their waters twisting into spirals that defied gravity. Citizens gasped as droplets hung suspended, shimmering like stars. "The city is alive," one whispered. "Or perhaps it is being controlled." The palace itself became a theater of impossibility. Doors opened into corridors that no one had built. Staircases shifted mid-step, and voices echoed from silent walls. Guards saw figures walking through stone, vanishing. Engineers worked tirelessly, dismantling conduits, but their tools failed them. Instruments spun wildly, deepening the chaos. One admitted, "This is not malfunction, it is defiance." The systems refuse to obey. Priests, desperate for answers, turned to the temples. Their chants were drowned out by vibrations, tones so deep they shook the pillars, mocking their rituals. "It is not the gods," one whispered. "It is something older." Thoth stood in silence, watching the impossible unfold. His words carried the weight of inevitability. The Watcher does not strike with weapons. It bends reality. It shows us our brilliance is fragile. Our laws of nature are not laws at all, but permissions that can be revoked. Atlantis stood radiant, yet fragile. Its power, once the foundation of eternity, had become a force that defied explanation. And in that defiance, the city realized it was no longer in control. The power that defied explanation had shaken Atlantis. But the true terror came when the city's lifeblood, its energy systems, began to unravel. The canals, once glowing with steady currents of crystal light, surged unpredictably. Waves of energy rippled through the waterways, shorting out bridges and flooding districts with uncontrolled force. Citizens fled as the very systems that sustained them turned volatile, unpredictable, and hostile. In the towers, conduits flickered violently. Some rooms were plunged into darkness, while others blazed with unbearable brilliance. Communication crystals carried distorted signals, voices overlapping in languages no one understood. Engineers worked frantically, but their instruments betrayed them. Readings contradicted, gauges spun wildly. The palace itself trembled. Its great crystal heart pulsed erratically, sending shockwaves through the marble floors. Courtiers stumbled as corridors shook. Guards dropped their weapons as the walls hummed with dissonant energy. Priests gathered in the temples, desperate to restore balance. Yet their chants were drowned out by vibrations, tones so deep they rattled the pillars and silenced the voices of the faithful. "It is not the gods," one whispered. "It is something older, something that bends the systems to its will." Thoth stood among the chaos, his eyes heavy with sorrow. "The Watcher does not strike with armies," he said. "It strikes by unraveling what we believe eternal. Atlantis's brilliance is not being destroyed, it is being rejected." Fear spread across the city. Families abandoned their homes, merchants closed their stalls, and soldiers hesitated to patrol. The disruptions were no longer anomalies. They were the unraveling of Atlantis itself. Atlantis stood radiant, yet fragile. Its energy systems, once the foundation of eternity, had become unstable and dangerous. The storm was no longer approaching. It had entered the veins of the empire. As Atlantis's energy systems faltered and the city trembled, whispers of unease spread through its grand temples. Priests, once certain, were now haunted by doubts they dared not speak. Yet rumors escaped even the most sacred walls. It began with unsettling dreams. priests saw visions of vast oceans swallowing towers and shadows stretching across stars. Offerings on altars were rearranged, symbols carved into stone without human hand. Was this divine intervention or intrusion from something far older? The priests debated endlessly, their certainty crumbling. Rumors spread like wildfire among the people. Citizens gathered outside temples, demanding answers. Fear turned to suspicion, and suspicion to anger. Temples, once sanctuaries, became centers of unrest. Inside the council chamber, rulers demanded clarity. Are these omens? Are the gods warning us? But the priests could not agree. Some claimed illusions, others admitted the unthinkable. This is not the work of gods. It is something watching us, something that has no name. Thoth listened carefully, his expression grave. The watcher does not reveal itself, he said. It speaks through whispers, through dreams, through shadows. You seek answers from the gods, but the gods are silent. What you hear is not divinity, it is intrusion. The rumors spread like fire, igniting fear across the empire. Atlantis stood radiant, yet fragile. Its temples, once symbols of certainty, had become places of doubt. The Watcher's presence grew stronger. The storm was no longer hidden. It had entered the sacred halls. The rumors within the temples had unsettled Atlantis, but soon the whispers gave way to something far more tangible. Signs of a vast presence beyond the horizon began with the sailors returning from distant voyages. They spoke of waters that churned without wind, of skies that bent unnaturally, and of shadows moving beneath the waves. Shadows larger than any creature known to man followed their ships, pulled by unseen forces. Currents pulled them toward places no map recorded, a chilling journey into the unknown. Fishermen reported nets torn apart by something immense, their boats rocked by vibrations rising from the deep. It is not the sea, one muttered, trembling. It is something within it. Then came the stars. Astronomers charting the heavens noticed constellations shifting in ways that suggested intelligence. Patterns emerged, deliberate, precise, as though the sky itself was being rearranged to send a message. It is not random, one whispered. It is deliberate. They had seen the waters churn, the stars bend, the shadows move. Fear spread across the empire, carried by sailors' tales and astronomers' warnings. A palpable dread settled over the city. Thoth listened carefully, his voice heavy with recognition. The Watcher does not strike openly, he said. It surrounds us. It waits beyond the horizon, vast and patient. What you see in the sea, in the sky, are not accidents. They are signals. Atlantis is not alone. The capital grew restless. Families refused to live near the canals. Merchants abandoned trade routes. Soldiers hesitated to patrol the coast. The brilliance of Atlantis, once a beacon of pride, now felt exposed, vulnerable to a presence that never revealed itself, yet made its existence undeniable. Atlantis stood radiant, yet fragile. The horizon was no longer a boundary of safety. It had become a veil, behind which something vast and unseen waited. The storm was no longer distant. It was pressing closer, carried by the sea and written in the stars. The presence beyond the horizon had unsettled Atlantis. But the most chilling discovery came not from the sea or stars. It came from the archives buried deep beneath the capital. Scholars, desperate to understand the signs, unearthed scrolls sealed for centuries, parchment brittle, ink faded, yet the words carried a weight that silenced the chamber. The records spoke of a stranger, a figure who appeared in civilizations long before Atlantis, always at the edge of collapse, always watching. The descriptions were vague, fragmented, but consistent. A presence cloaked in silence, never striking openly, yet always leaving ruin in its wake. Some texts called it the Watcher, others the Shadow Beyond. A few dared to suggest it was not a being at all, but an intelligence woven into the fabric of reality. One passage chilled the scholars most. It does not conquer. It waits. It bends the laws of nature until the proud destroy themselves. The council dismissed the records as myth, insisting Atlantis was too advanced to fall to superstition. But Thoth recognized the patterns. He had seen distortions in the stars, whispers in the canals, the defiance of the energy systems. The stranger in the records was not legend, it was here. Rumors spread quickly. Citizens whispered that Atlantis was repeating history, that the stranger had returned to test them. Priests argued whether it was divine punishment or intrusion from something older than the gods. Merchants feared the city was cursed, built upon foundations already marked by ruin. The capital grew restless. Families avoided the archives, terrified of what else might be hidden. Soldiers refused to guard the vaults, claiming the walls themselves whispered at night. The stranger in the records had become more than myth. It was a presence felt in every corner. Thoth spoke quietly, his voice heavy with inevitability. You search for names, for faces, for enemies, but the stranger does not reveal itself. It is not seen. It is only felt, and it has already entered Atlantis. Atlantis stood radiant, yet fragile. The records had revealed a truth too terrifying to ignore. The city was not facing its first enemy. It was facing the same force that had undone civilizations before it. The storm was no longer a mystery. It was history repeating itself. The stranger in the records had revealed a chilling truth, but Atlantis's downfall accelerated when its most trusted systems began to betray them. It started with the communication crystals. Messages that once traveled instantly now arrived, garbled, fragmented, or reversed. Some carried voices no one recognized, speaking in languages older than Atlantis itself. Others transmitted silence, followed by faint echoes. Engineers tore apart the conduits, but found no fault. It is not broken, one whispered. It is refusing. The transport systems faltered next. Carriages powered by crystal energy froze mid-journey, their wheels locked as if gripped by invisible hands. Bridges that had stood for centuries collapsed without warning, their supports crumbling though no damage was visible. Citizens fled in panic, realizing that the very structures they trusted had turned against them. In the capital, the great archives suffered inexplicable failures. Scrolls disintegrated into dust when touched, tablets cracked without pressure, and inscriptions rearranged themselves into patterns no scholar could decipher. Knowledge itself seemed to rebel, as though history was being rewritten by unseen forces. The palace was not spared. Its protective shields flickered, sometimes vanishing entirely, leaving the rulers exposed. Doors refused to open, corridors shifted direction, and the council chamber itself trembled as though rejecting those who entered. priests declared the failures divine punishment, but Thoth knew better. The Watcher does not destroy, he said, bends. It twists what we believe eternal until it fails without cause. Our brilliance is not being attacked. It is being undone. Fear spread like wildfire. Families abandoned their homes. Merchants ceased trade, and soldiers refused to patrol. The Empire's lifeblood, its technology, had become unreliable, unpredictable, and dangerous. Atlantis stood radiant, yet fragile. Its systems, once the foundation of eternity, had failed without cause. And in that failure, the Watcher's presence was undeniable. The storm was no longer hidden in whispers or shadows. It had entered the very heart of Atlantis's brilliance, turning its greatest strength into its greatest weakness. As Atlantis's technology faltered and whispers of the Watcher spread, the Empire's rulers retreated into secrecy. Behind the gilded doors of the council chamber, a hidden conflict began to fracture the unity that had once defined the city. The debates were fierce. Some rulers insisted that disruptions were natural flaws in the systems, accidents magnified by fear. Others argued that the priests were right, that Atlantis had angered the gods and divine punishment was upon them. A few, pale and trembling, admitted the unthinkable. This is not divine, it is intrusion. Something is watching us. The chamber grew tense. Voices rose. Accusations flew. One counselor accused another of spreading panic to seize power. Another claimed the engineers were sabotaging the systems to weaken the Empire. Trust dissolved, replaced by suspicion. The rulers, once united in brilliance, now turned against one another. Outside the chamber, rumors spread of secret meetings, of alliances forming in the shadows. Soldiers whispered that orders contradicted one another. Merchants claimed the council was hiding truths, and citizens began to wonder whether their leaders were protecting them or betraying them. Thoth, invited to speak, stood silently as the rulers argued. When he finally spoke, his words cut through the chaos. "You fight among yourselves," he said, "but the enemy does not need to divide you. You are dividing yourselves. The Watcher does not strike with armies, it strikes with fear. And fear has already entered this chamber." The council fell silent, but only for a moment. Pride and paranoia returned, louder than wisdom. They dismissed Thoth, but his words lingered in the minds of those who listened. The hidden conflict behind closed doors was no longer hidden. It seeped into the streets, into the temples, into the hearts of the people. Atlantis stood radiant, yet fragile. Its brilliance was not undone by the Watcher alone, but by the fractures within its own walls. The storm was no longer outside. It had entered the Empire's highest circle, and from within, the collapse had already begun. The hidden conflict within the council had fractured Atlantis's unity. But what followed was far more dangerous. Fear consuming the elite circle itself. Behind the palace walls, paranoia spread like wildfire. Rulers who once stood proudly together now avoided one another, whispering in private chambers. Some believed fellow counselors were secretly aligned with the priests. Others suspected the engineers of sabotage, and a few whispered that Thoth himself was guiding the Watcher. The palace became a labyrinth of suspicion. Guards were reassigned constantly, corridors patrolled with unease, and meetings held in secrecy. Every decision was questioned, every word weighed for hidden meaning. The brilliance of Atlantis's leadership had turned inward, devouring itself. At night, the counselors dreamed of collapse, towers crumbling, canals flooding, shadows stretching across the city. They woke, trembling, convinced the visions were not dreams but warnings. Some refused to sleep at all, pacing the marble halls with hollow eyes. Fear seeped into their decisions. Resources were hoarded, districts abandoned, and orders contradicted one another. Soldiers received conflicting commands. Merchants were taxed without reason, and citizens began to wonder whether their leaders were protecting them. Thoth watched silently, his sorrow deepening. "The watcher does not need to strike," he said quietly. "It has already won. Fear is the weapon, and you wield it against yourselves." But his words fell on deaf ears. The rulers, consumed by paranoia, saw enemies everywhere but the one that mattered. They turned suspicion into policy, fear into law, and mistrust into the foundation of their rule. Atlantis stood radiant, yet fragile. Its elite circle, once the guardians of eternity, had become prisoners of their own fear. The Watcher had not revealed itself, yet its presence was undeniable, reflected in the trembling hands of those who claimed to lead. The storm was no longer outside the walls. It had taken root in the minds of Atlantis's most powerful. Fear fractured Atlantis's elite. Desperation drove the Empire into a dangerous pursuit. Identifying the source of the disturbances, the Council summoned engineers, priests, and scholars, demanding answers. Laboratories buzzed with frantic activity, recalibrating instruments and dissecting crystals. Yet every test yielded contradictions. Readings shifted mid-measurement, devices failed without reason, and results dissolved into chaos. "It is not malfunction," one engineer admitted. "It is resistance." The systems refused to reveal the truth. Priests turned to the temples, seeking divine clarity. They performed rituals in secret, chanting through the night. But their visions were fragmented shadows, stretching across oceans, voices speaking in riddles, stars rearranging into patterns no one could decipher. Some claimed the gods were warning them. Others whispered that the visions were deception, illusions cast by something older than divinity. Scholars scoured the archives, searching for parallels in ancient records. They uncovered fragments describing civilizations undone by unseen forces, patterns of collapse eerily similar to Atlantis's plight. One passage chilled them most. It hides in silence. It bends reality. It reveals itself only when collapse is inevitable. The council grew restless. Some demanded the priests be silenced. Others accused the engineers of incompetence, and a few insisted Thoth was manipulating the Empire with fear. The search for answers had become a battlefield of suspicion. Each faction convinced the other was hiding the truth. Thoth, weary but resolute, spoke quietly. "You seek names, faces, enemies, but the Watcher does not reveal itself. It is not a creature to be hunted, nor a god to be appeased. It is presence, it is intrusion, and it has already entered Atlantis." The attempts to identify the source only deepened the mystery. The Empire's brilliance, once a beacon of certainty, now seemed powerless. Powerless against an enemy that refused to be named. Atlantis stood radiant, yet fragile. Its search for answers had become a spiral of confusion, deception, and fear. And in that spiral, the Watcher's grip tightened. The storm was no longer a question of if. It was a question of when. The search for answers had driven Atlantis into chaos. But the most chilling revelation came not from the skies or archives. It came from the depths of the ocean itself. It began with the divers, sent to investigate the trembling canals and strange vibrations beneath the city. They returned pale and trembling, speaking of voices that echoed through the water. These were not human voices, nor the chants of priests, but resonant tones that seemed to carry meaning. It was not sound, one diver whispered. It was language. The sea was speaking. Soon, the city's instruments began to detect signals rising from the abyss. Pulses of energy, rhythmic and deliberate, surged upward from trenches deeper than any Atlantean had ever mapped. The patterns were too precise to be natural. They resembled messages, coded, intentional, directed at Atlantis itself. The priests gathered in the temples, attempting to interpret the signals. Some claimed they were warnings from the gods. Others insisted they were curses. But Thoth, studying the vibrations, recognized something far more disturbing. These are not divine, he said. They are transmissions. The depths are not silent. They are speaking to us. The messages grew stronger. Crystals along the canals resonated with the pulses, glowing in sync with the rhythms. Citizens reported hearing whispers rising from the water at night, voices calling their names, urging them to listen. Children woke, screaming, claiming the ocean itself was alive. Fear spread across the empire. Families abandoned homes near the coast. Merchants refused to sail, and soldiers hesitated to guard the harbors. The brilliance of Atlantis, once a beacon of pride, now felt exposed to something vast and unseen beneath the waves. Thoth's words echoed through the capital. The Watcher does not strike with armies. It speaks from the depths. It reminds us that our foundations are fragile, that beneath our brilliance lies a silence that is not empty but alive. Atlantis stood radiant, yet fragile. The ocean, once its ally, had become a messenger of something older, something patient, something watching. The storm was no longer distant. It was rising from the depths, carrying messages that no one dared to fully understand. The messages from the depths had shaken Atlantis to its core. The true breaking point came when the empire realized its grip on stability was slipping away. It began subtly. Systems that once obeyed flawlessly now resisted even the simplest commands. Crystals powering the canals surged unpredictably, flooding districts with bursts of uncontrolled energy. Communication devices carried overlapping voices, some Atlantean, others unrecognizable, as if the city itself was speaking in tongues. The council tried to impose order. Engineers were commanded to restore the conduits, priests to silence the whispers. Soldiers were commanded to guard the trembling streets, but every effort failed. The systems no longer responded to human will. The empire's brilliance had become defiant, as though rejecting its creators. In the capital, panic spread. Merchants abandoned their stalls. Families fled their homes. Soldiers hesitated to follow orders that contradicted one another. The streets, once alive with confidence, now echoed with confusion. Citizens whispered that Atlantis was no longer in control, that something else had taken hold. Inside the palace, the rulers argued endlessly. Some insisted the failures were sabotage. Others claimed divine punishment. A few whispered the unthinkable. The Watcher has entered our systems. We are no longer masters of our own city. Thoth stood silently, watching the chaos unfold. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of inevitability. Control is not lost in a single moment, he said. It slips gradually, like sand, through the fingers. You believed Atlantis eternal, but eternity is fragile. The Watcher does not conquer. It waits until you realize you are no longer in command. The realization spread like fire. Atlantis stood radiant, yet fragile. Its brilliance, once the foundation of eternity, had become a force beyond its control. The Empire's grip had slipped, and in that moment, the Watcher's presence was undeniable. The storm was no longer approaching. It had already taken hold, and Atlantis was powerless to stop it. The moment control began to slip, Atlantis's unity fractured. What had once been a city of brilliance and certainty now became a battlefield of suspicion, its people divided by fear and mistrust. In the streets, citizens whispered that the priests were hiding truths, that the engineers were sabotaging the systems, that the council itself was conspiring against them. Families avoided neighbors. Merchants accused rivals of treachery, and soldiers began to question the very orders they were given. The Empire's strength was unraveling from within. The council, consumed by paranoia, turned suspicion into policy. Surveillance increased, patrols doubled, and accusations spread like wildfire. Those who spoke of the Watcher were silenced, branded as traitors or deceivers. Yet the silence only deepened the fear, convincing many that the rulers were hiding something far worse than they admitted. Priests, once revered, now faced hostility. Citizens accused them of summoning the disturbances, of aligning with forces beyond Atlantis. Temples became battlegrounds of rumor, their sanctity shattered by suspicion. Engineers fared no better, blamed for every failure, every collapse, every flicker of crystal light. Thoth watched the divisions grow, his sorrow heavy. "The Watcher does not need to strike," he said quietly. "It waits until you destroy yourselves. Fear is the weapon, and you wield it against one another." But his words could not stop the spiral. The people turned inward, mistrust consuming every bond. Soldiers refused to fight beside one another. Merchants abandoned trade. Families locked themselves away. Atlantis, radiant and proud, had become a city of shadows. Each citizen convinced the enemy was not beyond the horizon, but standing beside them. The paranoia spread into every corner of the Empire. The Watcher had not revealed itself, yet its presence was undeniable. It had entered the hearts of Atlantis's people, twisting unity into division, trust into suspicion, brilliance into fragility. Atlantis stood radiant, yet fragile. Its collapse was no longer a distant threat. It was unfolding from within, driven not by armies or weapons, but by fear and paranoia. The storm was no longer outside the walls. It had become the Empire itself. Paranoia consumed Atlantis. Scholars delved into archives, desperate for answers. They uncovered terrifying evidence of an older civilization. This civilization was erased from memory, yet left faint traces behind. In vaults beneath the capital, tablets were found, carved in languages no Atlantean could decipher. Their symbols spoke of radiant cities, powered by systems similar to Atlantis's own. Yet every record ended the same way: collapse, silence, disappearance. Explorers returned with fragments of ruins. These ruins were buried beneath oceans and deserts. Towers half submerged, conduits shattered, warning of a presence that bent reality itself. "We are not the first," a scholar whispered. "Others stood where we stand. Others fell as we are falling." The council tried to suppress the findings, fearing panic, but word spread quickly among the citizens. They whispered that Atlantis was repeating history, that the Watcher had tested civilizations before, and erased them without trace. Priests argued whether these ruins were divine punishment or proof of a force older than the gods. Thoth studied the fragments with grim recognition. These civilizations believed themselves eternal, he said. They built systems of brilliance. They trusted in their power. But eternity is fragile. The Watcher does not conquer. It waits. And when pride blinds, collapse follows. The evidence was undeniable. Atlantis stood radiant, yet fragile. Its brilliance was not unique, its systems not eternal. Others had risen before, others had fallen, and the Watcher had been there each time. The storm was no longer a mystery. It was a cycle, repeating across ages, and Atlantis had become its next chapter. The evidence of older civilizations had shaken Atlantis. The empire's fear demanded a face, a name, an enemy. And so the rulers declared that the Watcher had been revealed. In the council chamber, a proclamation was made. Strange figures seen in temples, shadows moving through canals, voices rising from the depths all were signs of a hidden adversary. "It is here," one counselor insisted. "We have identified the source. The Watcher is among us." The people erupted with panic and relief in equal measure. Panic because the enemy was near. Relief because at last it had a name. Soldiers were dispatched to patrol the streets. Priests ordered to banish the shadows. Engineers commanded to seal the canals. Atlantis moved as though it had grasped the truth. But the truth was elusive. Figures vanished when approached. Shadows dissolved into silence. The voices shifted into riddles. Every attempt to capture the enemy ended in failure. The Watcher remained unseen, untouchable, undefined. Whispers spread quickly. Had the council truly revealed the enemy? Or had they invented one to mask their own fear? Citizens began to doubt. Merchants refused to fund the search, and soldiers muttered they were chasing illusions. Thoth spoke quietly, his words heavy with warning. "You cannot reveal what does not show itself. The Watcher is not a creature to be hunted, nor a shadow to be banished. It is presence. It is intrusion, and it thrives when you believe you have found it." Atlantis stood radiant, yet fragile. The enemy had been revealed, but doubt lingered. Was it truly the Watcher, or merely fear given form? The Empire's brilliance had turned against itself, mistaking shadows for certainty. The storm was no longer about what lay beyond the horizon. It was about what Atlantis chose to believe on, whether that belief was truth or deception. The silence before the fall did not last. Atlantis, radiant yet fragile, reached the moment when collapse was no longer a threat. It was a reality. It began with the canals. Their currents surged uncontrollably, flooding districts and shattering bridges. Energy that once obeyed the Empire's command now lashed out violently, striking towers and igniting fires across the capital. Citizens fled in panic, realizing the systems they trusted had turned against them. Communication crystals failed entirely. Messages dissolved into static. Voices overlapped in chaos, and signals carried only echoes of fear. The Empire's unity, already fractured, was severed completely. Soldiers received no orders, merchants no guidance, families no reassurance. Atlantis was blind and deaf in its most desperate hour. The palace trembled. Its great crystal heart pulsed erratically. Shockwaves rippled through the marble floors. Corridors collapsed, shields flickered, and the council chamber itself cracked as though rejecting those who ruled. The rulers, consumed by paranoia, shouted accusations, even as the walls crumbled around them. Priests gathered in the temples, chanting desperately, but their voices were drowned out by vibrations rising from the depths. The ocean roared, its pulses resonating with the failing systems, as if mocking Atlantis's collapse. Thoth stood among the chaos, his voice steady though sorrowful. "The Watcher does not strike with armies," he said. "It waits until pride blinds, until fear divides, until control slips, and then collapse is inevitable. You believed yourselves eternal, but eternity is fragile." Atlantis stood radiant, yet fragile. Its brilliance had become its undoing, its systems, its betrayers, its unity, its weakness. The collapse was no longer a distant threat. It had been triggered, and the Empire was powerless to stop it. The storm was no longer approaching. It had arrived, and Atlantis was falling. The collapse had been triggered, and Atlantis's brilliance dissolved into ruin. Towers crumbled, canals surged uncontrollably, and the One's eternal empire was swallowed by its own fragility. Yet, even as the city fell, one question lingered, a question that echoes across ages. Was the Watcher truly an enemy, or was it a mirror reflecting the pride, fear, and divisions that had already hollowed Atlantis from within? The priests claimed it was divine punishment. The scholars insisted it was intrusion from something older than the gods. The rulers, consumed by paranoia, believed it was sabotage. But Thoth, standing among the ruins, spoke the words that endure. "The Watcher does not conquer. It waits. It bends reality until the proud destroy themselves." The question is not what the Watcher is. The question is what we are when it comes. Atlantis stood radiant, yet fragile. Its fall was not only the story of a city undone, but a warning carried forward through time. Civilizations rise, systems shine, pride blinds, and always the question remains, was it the Watcher or was it us? The storm passed, but the echoes endure. The ruins of Atlantis whisper not of defeat, but of fragility. And today, as new empires rise, the same question waits patiently unanswered. Good night.